Hao?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Hao, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in all over the world. It's fun to see where everyone's coming from. Before I get started, I would like to thank NITC for their support of this project originally, both in content and in target, because this isn't a traditional research project. It's a combination of a research project that's intended to be applied in orientation and to help move and assist communities in moving forward in changing their practice locally. I'd also like to thank the Sustainable Cities Initiative at the University of Oregon that also helped administer and support this work. I'd also, before I get going with the content, like to acknowledge the co-authors and contributors to the work, including John Rao, who's a professor here at the University of Oregon in architecture, and two now former students, Kelly Sanford, who was an architecture graduate student, and Dave Amos, who was a architecture and a planning master's student. And both of them are currently successfully employed, which is fantastic after finishing last June. Okay, so thank you very much for everyone tuning in, and I'm really pleased to present this work. And I look forward to your questions, and more importantly, I look forward to you hopefully using this work to make your streets and your transportation systems work better in your communities. So there are a lot of streets like this all around the country.
Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your screen.
Okay.
So can you try selecting the option to share your screen?
Yeah, I can.
There we go.
All right.
Perfect.
Here's the beautiful first slide with everyone's names. So thank you again to those people. Okay, can you see this now? Great. So there are a lot of streets like this one all around the country, and increasingly we as a society are wanting something different than we've had in the past with how we think about the use of these streets. And there are all kinds of reasons why this pressure is emerging. So there's a shift in preference of where to live and how to travel by both younger and older Americans. So according to a recent national study by the American Planning Association, there's now actually an alignment between two key demographic groups for a different type of urban form or use of our streets in particular, when we're accessing the destinations of daily life do not always require a car. In general, across the country, the supply of these types of environments where people can get around in multiple ways of getting around, multiple modes of transportation, in general, the supply is not meeting this increased demand for it. So for cities, and when I mean cities, I'm not just talking about the biggest cities around the country. These are cities of all sizes everywhere. If cities, urban areas, communities want to remain economically competitive, they're going to need to figure out how to attract both young talent, the millennials, and allow people to age in place or even retire as active boomers, people who still have plenty of life and wisdom to give, but don't want to be restricted in where they live by being dependent on a vehicle. So the transportation systems that we provide and how we design our streets are critical to meet the shift of preference that's happening across our society. Of course, there are huge environmental demands that we're facing as well. So a changing climate and our collective response to that challenge puts pressure on our transportation system in two ways. Both we need to create systems that are resilient in the face of changing extreme weather events, and also we need to figure out how we can reduce our carbon dioxide output from our current system, in part by creating sustainable transportation systems that allow more non-motorized travel as conveniently and as comfortably as we have created our current system for motorized travel. From the public health side of things, there are also challenges. We are a country in the middle of an obesity epidemic, and pressure is being put on our streets to create more opportunities for active transportation, active travel, walking and biking, so that more people can get some physical activity just by getting around to do the things that they normally do. And infrastructure costs. This is a perpetual problem that many cities face in terms of actually maintaining what we have in terms of our streets. There are fewer resources to build or even to maintain our current infrastructure. So reducing wear and tear of that system is important, and the reality is that addressing congestion is likely to be done not by building more roads, but by using our existing roads more efficiently. So in the face of congestion, actually many people are questioning how to best use our street space efficiently. Is the purpose of our streets to move vehicles, or is it to move people? In fact, in the US, you might know this, that average vehicle occupancy for work trips is just over 1 person per vehicle. So I often give students here at the University of Oregon an assignment to pretty much just sit and observe traffic for a couple of hours on a commercial road and count the number of occupied and unoccupied seats traveling by. And really quickly it just becomes apparent that our streets are mostly transporting empty seats. And so the question is that what we want to use in our public roads? Is that the most efficient way to use our public resources? So of course, in the face of congestion, we can think about a street being full of cars, but really, if we're really just transporting 1 person per vehicle, there's many other ways that we can think about moving them about, by bike, walking, or by transit. It becomes a different way to think about efficiency of public goods that we all invest in, pay for, and utilize. So there's a real shift happening all across the country due to these different measures, and you pick the one that feels right to you in your professional and your community context, whether it's the efficiency of our public goods, the cost of maintaining those public goods, public health, environmental challenges, or just the changing household preferences around the country and how our communities can remain competitive in the face of those changes. So these pressures are actually putting a change on how we frame our basic transportation system, how we think about transportation in general, and what the purpose of our streets are. So in the current framing, or as I put here, the old framing, given that we're in this transition period, we tend to think of our streets as places where we want to maximize mobility, the ability to travel fast and unimpeded, and to maximize the throughput of vehicles through space. We measure that through an average daily traffic measure, which is focused on the movement of counting the number of vehicles over a day. We measure that by how we get to work and what's the modal split on our journey to work. We look at the congestion of our streets based on how crowded they are during the peak hour. And the guiding Bibles or guidebooks that help us design our streets and make these decisions locally come from both ASHTO and UTCD. And overall, our typical framework is, what can we do to reduce congestion? That congestion seems to be the #1 evil that we are constantly trying to solve. So this is the framing that we've been in for the last 50 or 70 years, and for the most part still are in, and that we're most of us have grown up within, and so this feels very comfortable. That said, given these challenges that are before us, we're beginning to see some shifts in thinking, some questioning of that old framework, and that rather than thinking about our streets as places that move vehicles through space unimpeded, perhaps the purpose and focus of our streets should be how we help people access the places they want to go. And in some cases that results in the same type of mix that we have on our streets, but in other times that might lead to a different mix of modes. Instead of just the throughput of vehicles, maybe now we're thinking about streets as being both corridors to get through space, but streets are actually places that we like to be as well, places, destinations in and of themselves. When we go and we meet people for coffee or for a beer or for a restaurant or for just urban vitality, running into people, social connections, those are places, and how we design our streets to create places different than designing streets to maximize throughputs. Instead of measuring ADT solely by looking at the volume of vehicles going through space, perhaps we should look at the volume of vehicles, volume on transit, number of people who are walking, the number of people who are biking, to have a more complete measure of the full function and use of a street. You know, the journey to work trips are actually not a majority of trips that American takes. So in its new framing, the goal is to capture all types of trips that people are making, not just the journey to work. And what does that mean for how we allocate space on our streets and rethink our streets? Instead of just the peak hour, the peak rush hour, 1 or 2 hours a day, or in my city of Eugene, it's a half hour in the evening, maybe we should be thinking about the use of our streets for the other 23 7.5 hours a day. There's a new guidebook to supplement the AASHTO MUTCD called NACTO. If you're not familiar with it, it's amazing, which comes from the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is a set of design and practice and guidelines for city functions of streets, which are different than rural and highway functions. And so we should have some increased flexibility in how we design our streets based on the different needs and uses in the different urban or development contexts from rural to center city. And instead of congestion reduction, maybe we're in a world now where we're thinking about congestion alternatives, where building more roads as a way to fix congestion is not the only strategy that we might want to employ, but squeezing efficiencies out of the current system and looking for other ways of moving about for some of the trips that some of us take might be a better way to move forward. So we have this framing that's changing, and given that changing landscape, we can still look at streets like this, but we can look at them anew and decide if a street like this, which is 4 lanes, bike lanes, and a sidewalk, in this case, which separates a school on the right side from a neighborhood on the left, if that's the optimal design. Or if a street like this might be more appropriate, given that a single travel lane in each direction with a center turn lane makes it much easier to cross as a pedestrian, and vehicular throughput might actually remain the same. So this is that same street that I just showed you in the before and after. And in fact, it took so the school's on the right and the neighborhood's on the left, and it took a child a few years ago being hit and killed crossing this street to wake people up to think about how to redesign a street like this. And this is a typical amount of vehicular volume on the street, although during school drop-off in the morning it might be more crowded. This is typically what it is throughout the day. And so this street was redesigned to look like this. So crossing is safer, cycling is more comfortable, and in fact the throughput has not been impeded at all. So of course we don't want to wait for such tragic events to happen to prompt redesigns of our streets. Yet imagining how a redesigned street may look or perform is difficult for most of us to imagine, even those of us in the transportation profession. Streets, buildings, these look like fixed objects in our communities, unchangeable. And to imagine anything different and how that different design might perform is a big stretch for most of us to fully realize, contemplate, and understand in a useful way. So change is hard. So the question is, to me at least, is how can we help a community move forward with redesigning a street like this, but in a way that's based on evidence and experience from other completed projects, and to get that information into a format that multiple community stakeholders can use and understand, including engineers, planners, designers, elected officials, and general community members who often get involved in the types of discussions, debates, etc., how to use our streets and maybe how to redesign our streets and to meet new purposes. But when it comes down to it, reimagining this street, a street like this, is really hard to do, as I mentioned, even though it's been done hundreds, if not thousands of times before across the country. So this is actually a street that prompted the book. It's a 4-lane road in a commercial node surrounded by residential areas to either side, and it's only about 1 to 2 miles from downtown Eugene here in Oregon, and it's 1 to 2 miles from the University of Oregon. So it's a key commercial area. There's a lot of businesses on either side. It's a major throughway for vehicles, and as you can hopefully see in this image, it's severely lacking in pedestrian or bicycle or transit infrastructure. Yet the process to reimagine this street has been long and arduous and fraught with political divisions. Even though a street like this, we can point to examples all over the country on how to redesign it. And in fact, many in the transportation profession could spend about 10 minutes, 10 seconds coming up with a basic redesign of the street based on experience elsewhere. So the knowledge of what to do isn't necessarily the barrier here. It's that it's it's working with multiple stakeholders in a community to understand what might be possible and how it might function in a redesign. That's the key barrier, putting that knowledge into practice. And so this book was really born from our desire for other communities across the country to have an easier time implementing obvious updates to street designs by providing evidence from projects that have already been done rather than relying just on hypothetical renderings. So the pain and suffering that we're experiencing here in Eugene, Oregon over redoing this road prompted and motivated, inspired us to put together this book so that your communities might not have to go through similar pain and suffering in your own efforts to really try to make streets work, to maximize the use of your streets to meet multiple benefits for your community, whether it's vehicular access, economic activity of local businesses, creating more vibrant community feeling streets, providing better bicycle or pedestrian environments, or transit environments, but to do it in a way that is less painful. That's our goal. So this is what we came up with, and we are enormously proud of the final product and have been really thrilled at the response that we have been receiving from a wide variety of stakeholders across the country. So the process of putting this book together included a lot of different steps. So first, we wanted to base it on case studies from around the country. We did not want to target just a single part of the country so that in other regions of the country we wanted to say, oh, you guys in the Pacific Northwest, you can do anything. We can't do that over in the South, or we can't do that in the Northeast, or we didn't want that. So we have case studies from all over the country. We focus mostly on streets that mostly went through commercial corridors, so there's some consistency across the examples. And it's really those commercial corridors that put the most pressure on use of the streets by different modes and different purposes. For the most part, the examples in this book are, I'll call them average projects rather than signature projects, meaning most examples in the streets in this book are not sexy, award-winning, amazing, complicated redesigns. The after pictures and the after environment and the before environment, or I should say the after environment, in a lot of cases doesn't look that radical, and that was what we were going for. This is kind of normal projects that normal communities are doing to meet their normal everyday modes, and to show some of the evidence that came out from after that. The projects that we included in here had to be completed projects so that we could tell a before and after story, and there had to be some existing data that included evaluation of the performance of the projects, although the evaluation differs from each street example. So in some cases they're the same, in some cases they're different. We solicited the cases in this book using a variety of national networks, and so many thanks to the League of American Cyclists, the Association for Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, the Complete Streets National Coalition, the Oregon Department of Transportation, and all of the networks that those networks produced to help get the word out to communities around the country, to professionals to nominate and suggest streets in their communities that might be worthwhile candidates to put into this book. We then organized the final examples, the final 25, by type, including arterial rehabs, urban mixed-use streets, main streets, bike streets, and transit streets. And then we developed a way that we thought would be useful to communicate to the diverse set of stakeholders we wanted to take advantage of the book. So again, our target audience, transportation engineers and planners, local elected officials and other municipal staff that engage in street projects, professional urban designers, economic development officials, local businesses, and general community members who often engage in street retrofit projects. So the book is divided into three main sections. The first section we call our front matter, which has three main aspects to it. Some definitions around streets and transportation. We talk about some different design ideas and then lay out how to use the book. And the purpose of this front section is really to get that wide variety of stakeholders, to give them a common language and some background information on how to engage with transportation decision making so that the conversations that can happen at the local level can actually be based on a shared understanding. Now, oftentimes there's a real difference in power dynamic on street and transportation projects where the professional transportation engineers and planners hold a lot of knowledge, terminology, and so forth, that's quite intimidating for anyone else to engage in a productive way. And what we wanted to do is level that playing field so that the conversations can happen in an informed way that has trust among stakeholders. And I'll show a couple pages from that in just a moment. We then lay out the 25 examples, and it's a variety of street projects from across the country, as I mentioned. And there's sort of two ways to use the examples. You can look at a particular example that most closely mirrors the example in your community, knowing that, of course, there's always subtle differences and different contexts and so forth. Or you can look at the collection of examples and try to understand the collective story that gets told and try to tell that story in the conversations that you have in the community. And then we end with links and so forth to more resources if you'd like some more information and data to help back up the examples and the cases. So some of the front matter, as just an example. I'm not going to go through every page in the book. I'm not going to go through every case study in it. I will provide you a link on how you can access and access the material on your own so you can flip through it in more detail. But in the front section, for example, we lay out the idea of what ADT is and include a section on how one might actually visualize ADT. Often ADT is thrown out there as a number. And what does that mean? What does that look like? What does a street look like that can handle a certain volume of vehicles? And so elsewhere we define what ADT is and give some text context of it, but then we have also included this idea of visualizing. How do you visualize ADT? Taking 3 different streets that have more or less the same ADT but have 3 radically different street designs. So the idea here is that you can have an open conversation in the community. Here's the level of traffic. Here's some different designs that can handle that level of traffic. What looks best? So rather than a fight of yes or no, oh, here's a range of things that might happen. What do we want in our community? What do people think? We introduce the idea, or we highlight this idea of the difference between a speed limit versus a design speed, different ways to think about how we get certain behavior from vehicles on our streets. And this is information that every traffic engineer already knows, right? Because streets are designed to a certain speed limit on purpose. In fact, they're designed at a certain level, and then we post the streets with a lower speed limit, which is a little bit crazy, honestly, because if we've designed a street for a certain speed for comfort at traveling at that speed, our natural tendency as motorists would be to go that speed because that's what it's been designed. So we introduced this idea of speed limit versus designing a street to get the speed you want rather than posting a speed limit sign to get it. And then we show some examples. Right? So here's 3 different streets, all with a 25 mile per hour posted speed and 3 different designs. And you can begin engaging more people in that conversation. Well, which type of street do you think actually would get the behavior that you want? Right? So rather than community members saying, we need a street speed limit sign to slow the traffic down, we can have this type of discussion in the communities. Maybe a speed limit sign isn't really going to slow traffic down that much because we've designed the street to go twice as fast as what you're asking for. If we really want behavior of motorists to be to drive slower, then maybe it's about how we design our street. So again, it's introducing some vocabulary to a wider group of stakeholders in the community so they can engage in these conversations appropriately. And a lot of times, this is also concepts that many people across a city staff or local businesses might be very unfamiliar with. And so it's trying to engage everyone in that conversation in a productive way. We introduced the idea of the street cross-section. What are these different elements from the streetscape, curbs, parking, right-of-way, and give a little bit of information here about the costs of manipulating that right-of-way and that cross-section. So of course, expanding a right-of-way is expensive versus restriping travel lanes at least financially, doesn't cost a whole lot at all. Politically, maybe there's a different cost. But we try to introduce this, again, to try to help people have the conversation productively. And then each case study has a whole section, a whole series of common elements to them. So each case study is 4 pages, and I'll show you, I'll get into the cases here in just a moment. So each case study is 4 pages, all organized in the same basic way. So every case has this engineering bar that we call it, that you see here on the slide. So the type of street, what the right-of-way is, the length of the project that we're talking about, what was the speed limit before the project and after the redesign, what was the average daily traffic before and after the project happened, and then how long did the process take for the project itself. So every case has that type of information, which is kind of a standard bit of information to get people going. And we worked with some different traffic engineers to make sure that this is the type of information that would help add some seriousness to their paying attention to the rest of the material. Each case also has a street cross-section before and after. So what was, in all the cases, the right-of-way remained the same, but what were the lane widths and what were the lane allocations? So if it went from 4 travel lanes to 5 travel lanes, so 4 motorized travel lanes to maybe 2 throughput lanes, a center turn lane, and 2 bike lanes, what were the widths of the lanes before and after? What did the community have to play with in terms of space, and how did they deal with that? The spatial context, so what is the mass of buildings relative to the street? You know, what is the type of urban or development context that's there? A brief summary of what the project was, which is really important for politicians who are busy and want to know what was the project and what were the results, and give it to me in 3 bullet points. So we're sure to do that both with the summary and with the outcomes. And if there's any other helpful information that we felt would be useful to understand the context of the project, were there delays, or what did the project do during construction to support local businesses, what were some of the outcomes in terms of ADT or bicycle usage or collisions and accidents, or other behavior changes that were maybe softer in nature or unexpected in nature, and so forth. So that's the basic framing for each case. And so these next 2 slides are to lay out what each case study actually looks like. So these are the 4 pages. So every page starts with a before picture in the lower left and an after picture up top. So you can see what was the precondition and the post-condition. There's a summary of the basic project, what happened, what did they do in it, and then the city, state, and then the city size is included as well as the type of street that we're dealing with. So you can get a sense if you're trying to compare like-sized cities. Great. Of course, it's not always a fair comparison. So there's not many cities around the country where the metro population is going to be 12.5 million people. But when you think about a street like you see here on the screen, it's irrelevant that it's in the middle of a metro area of 12.5 million people, because this is actually a local commercial street to a local area. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned here that might be transferable to many parts of the country that are not in the 12.5 million person, very sunny metropolitan area of Southern California. So the second page includes the key facts and figures, or the engineering bar, however you want to describe that. This is the street cross-section before and after, and you won't be able to see it unless your eyes are really good, but whether it's a parking, travel lane, center median, so forth, and then there's the street widths before and the street widths after. The key outcomes, so what were the successes or the unintended consequences, are listed here, again in very short, very brief ways to communicate what happened. And this is really important for people who are busy and don't have a lot of time, but are important in the process of moving street projects forward in your community. The third page includes additional context of the street. So this is the street, and then we do this figure ground mapping to show the building mass, how dense or how urban or what's the low density, et cetera, what's sort of the urban form of the space, which is particularly useful to planners, may not be as easily read by others at first, but this is important for the sort of general context of where the street is. We try to include a map in every example to show a larger spatial context of where that street is in a greater urban mix, and then provide some really brief bullets to describe that in a text form. And then the fourth page includes additional information that seems useful to understand what the project was, including maybe some statistics or some pictures. Every case here is a little bit different. So that is the basic overview of how things are structured. So now I will go through a few examples, mostly to give you a sense of how the book and the cases look. So again, there's a variety of streets from all over the country, and the best way to use these cases is actually, I think, to use the book as a whole. But if you find a better way to use it, let me know. That would be great. Of course, every situation in your community may be a bit different, as I said before, and the examples, then the examples in this book, right? So you're never going to get an exact one-to-one match. But we've purposefully chosen a wide range of streets from different sized cities, mostly focusing on commercial activity, to try to make that transfer of knowledge as easy as possible and as relevant as possible. So again, I can't emphasize this enough. For the most part, the examples in this book are really normal looking projects. They're hardly award-winning or statement-making projects. They are examples of repurposing street space in ways that expand transportation choices in not very radical ways. I hope, if nothing else, you will get that, because I know, even here in progressive, bike-friendly Eugene, Oregon, we are having hard battles on how to rethink our streets. And I can only imagine, and I've heard from many people around the country, that these are very typical type of conversations, and difficult conversations often around the country. And the goal of this book is to make those conversations easier so that more projects can get done with less political animosity. So we don't want neighbors turning on neighbors just so people can go meet each other for a cup of coffee. So what you'll find by looking through the book in this collection is that there's a lot of opportunities to shift the allocation of space to better accommodate pedestrians and people on bikes in particular. That vehicular throughput generally does not diminish just by repurposing some parts of the street. Safety for all tends to improve, whether you're walking or biking, or if you're driving. Walking and biking rates tend to go up when you actually provide infrastructure that feels comfortable and safe for those modes. And that, in fact, when you create places that are good for people and not just the throughput of vehicles, economic activity tends to increase. So basically, projects like these have been widely successful in many parts of our country. So let's go through some examples. Okay, so here's where some of here's where the cases come from. So you can see all over, northwest, southwest. This Boulder hits the big middle, I guess maybe Missoula a little bit in the south, and some in the southeast, and some in the Midwest. So we try to grab all kinds of different cities, different city sizes, different politics, different community contexts, just to demonstrate that rethinking our streets are a universal goal or a universal topic of conversation no matter where you live across the country. So here's a few examples. I'm not going to go through every example in a lot of detail. I will leave that to you on your own time. But I'm just going to walk through a few pages of a few examples to give you a sense of what they look like and how they're laid out. And I'll point out a couple things in the examples that I've shown. And I have included a couple of the more signature type of things. But I'll start with this one in San Francisco, which I know in the political world may not be the best place to start. Well, I guess either in the political world or that it's a big city. But I'm showing you this street because the after picture here on top, I'm hopeful that if you look at that after picture, no one will look at that picture and think, wow, that is something so unique to San Francisco that it couldn't happen to our community. The land use, the density along the sides of the street might be a little bit different, but the allocation of the right-of-way of the street, to me, nothing of the street looks crazy, radical, award-winning, or anything that would feel threatening to anyone who lived or used a street like that. So the before picture in the lower left, the street was 2 lanes in each direction with no center turn lane. And so the project was really to restripe the road to improve vehicle travel times actually and to boost pedestrian activity along the street. And so this is a very typical road diet, actually not a full typical road diet because there's no bike lanes on here. So this would be a 4 to 3 lane conversion from traffic engineering speak, right, where you put a center turn lane so that vehicles who want to turn sort of move off from the throughput lane so that there remains a lane for throughput. One of the benefits that happened in this shift was that actually 2 main benefits happened. One, this is also a transit street, and before there was not enough room in the lanes, they were narrow, especially the right-hand lane, for a bus to stay in that lane. So it would straddle both lanes as it was moving down the street, which causes all kinds of uncertainty by other users. And so now the lane is really wide. There was no clear place to bike before because of the narrow travel lane on the right and the parked cars on the street. And now with an extra wide lane, in fact, more people have been using the street to bike. Even though there's no explicit bike infrastructure provided here, the wide lane provides a little bit more comfort for some people. And then the other thing that was happening here is because the travel lanes were so narrow before, a lot of people who were parking their cars on the side were doing the kind of European parking model, which is sort of half your vehicle on the street and half on the sidewalk, which then impedes the sidewalk for people who are walking. And in an environment like this, you would expect a lot of people walking, and so we wouldn't want that. And so this redesign actually ended up addressing all of those concerns. And again, the post example here, to me, is not an indication that the world is going to come to an end because we have reallocated space on a street in a way that works for more people. And so you can see the before and after cross sections. The travel lanes went from 9 and 10-foot travel lanes to a single 13.5 travel lane. The parking remained the same, the sidewalk remained the same, and now there's a center median. So this really is just a restriping project. Speed limits were the same. Some of the traffic volume actually decreased. Maybe some maybe got dispersed to other streets. Some modal shift happens. It's not totally clear. Although walking and biking did increase, travel time for transit, interestingly enough, actually increased. And vehicular throughput times weren't impeded at all. And what was nice is that as part of the project, there was some additional tree planting that happened to help enforce that cars should park in the street, which could be done more comfortably now. And so, in fact, the pedestrian realm was improved. So all that has been and has all been received positively from the public. So again, this is just to show that there are sections here describing the context, sort of where it is in the city, what type of, why people would be traveling along this route, who didn't live there, some of the density of the urban space by looking at the bottom, and then sort of an image of how it looks. And this is the 4th page in this case, where the European model of parking, I don't know if there's an official name for that, versus, so that was the before, sort of a very courteous move in some ways if you were parking your vehicle to keep space on the travel lane open for other vehicles and for buses to do that a little bit more comfortably by sacrificing some of the pedestrian realm. And now with the wider lane, this comfortable space for vehicles to park and planting of trees just reinforce the fact that you can't put half of your car on the sidewalk, which improves the pedestrian environment as well. And then there's just some additional information about things that are nearby. So that's one example, all 4 pages. I don't think in the subsequent examples I'm going to go through all 4 pages, but I'd just like to show you a few of the types of examples that are here. So here's one that's a little bit more of a signature project, really interesting to me. This is in Lancaster, California, a very suburb type area, fully built in the auto age, Southern California. This was their, what you would call their main street, which doesn't look very Main Street-ish, but very typical for many streets across the country. These types of streets happen everywhere. 4 travel lanes, a center turn lane. These are commercial areas on the side. And what they decided to do is they actually wanted to kind of retrofit the space to make more of a commercial node happen. And they did a really interesting project. So in the after image, what you can see is they made their street have 1 lane of transportation, of vehicular transportation in each direction, and they took the middle lanes and put the car parking there, which is a really interesting design idea. So for pedestrian crossing, you're just crossing 1 lane. For parking, it's a center parking for either. And the reason why they did this is that they wanted to have some festivals as well several times a year, and they wanted to redesign the street in a way that would accommodate festivals. So you can see in this center parking area, it's very nicely landscaped with lighting and so forth that translates into all these booths and lighting that help support that activity. So this was an example that was very explicitly designed and a fairly radical type of rethinking of what the use of the street would be. I find this really interesting in the type of environment where this was done, low density, suburban, auto-oriented Southern California, to rethink how they could use their street to not only serve the function of the throughput, but also to create place for the community where people could come and congregate and take advantage of local businesses in a way that's actually supportive for walking from one business to the next. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, the tourist kind of area near the beach. A very typical road diet or 4 to 5 lane conversion, so 4 travel lanes, 2 in each direction that turned into 5 lanes, so 1 travel lane in each direction for motorized vehicles plus a center turn lane, and then 2 lanes for bicycle transportation, which provides all kinds of benefit to this type of context. So it's a tourist area, people going to the beach, you have people on bikes as tourists, you have people walking from the beach to their hotels, to commercial areas and so forth. This environment as it was is not very friendly to those types of uses for the street. And so the redesign was to both provide for throughput, but to also provide amenities for other modes of getting around. Plus increasing landscaping just increase the comfort and for the scale of users. So increase the added mid-block crossings and the bike lanes to provide some legitimacy and some comfort for people using those modes. And they actually experienced decline in collisions. There's a little sort of update to this chart here. So the bar graph, so this is a long corridor, and part of it was changed and part of it was not. And so the 4-lane configuration is part of this long corridor that did not get changed, and the 3-lane configuration is part that did. And after the change, they noticed that the number of collisions and accidents, motorized collisions and accidents over a 6-month period radically declined on the 3-lane configuration. And I should say that the ADT decreased just slightly, but not much at all. Different type of street, Philadelphia, old center of Philadelphia, sort of back to the days of the beginnings of our country. So old part of the city, narrow streets, development form that's been there for hundreds of years. Ooh, what can we do with space like that? It's one thing to take a wide open suburban Southern California, low density, large street and rethink it, but what do you do with fairly narrow streets that have been in use for a long time with a right-of-way that's not changing? And so this was a project that added buffered bike lanes to this very old part of Philadelphia. So it's a one-way, in this particular case, it's a one-way couplet that provides cyclists with a safe and calm link between a couple key destinations. So one of the travel lanes was converted into the buffered bike lane with an exception here, which was there is not a lot of places to park your car, and on Sundays there's a lot of churches in the area, and so there was an allowance that on Sundays double parking or parking in the bike lane would be permitted. So that was the hybrid accommodation that happened. And of course, on most communities on Sunday mornings, there's not a lot of other vehicular traffic. So for people on bikes, there's not a lot of competition for the remainder of the road space. So that seemed to be a good compromise to accommodate an infrastructure that provided amenities for people on bikes 23 and a half days, 23, I should say, most days of the week, I guess 6.5 days per week, a great dedicated space for people on bikes, and a half-day a week it's a shared space on the motorized travel lane. A different example back to Southern California was a commercial area, auto-oriented area, and in this case there wasn't much change in the environment other than adding painted wide green stripes to indicate where there's a sharrow or a shared lane marking for bikes. So typically, if the sharrow type of infrastructure is going to be created, just this whatever you call those things, though I can't think of their names at the moment, but the paint on the road is put there. What they decided to do is add the thick green stripe along it, which is to say vehicles are still allowed here, but to increase the awareness for both vehicles and for people on bikes that, yeah, bikes really do belong here. And in fact, if you want to avoid biking and running into a door zone, bike here on this lane. And it's sort of a symbol of we are going to accommodate and say it's legitimate for you to get here by bike without actually decreasing any vehicular travel lanes at all. So it was an interesting experiment. And it's an experiment that seems to be working. Southern California, a lot of people do want to use a bike, or at least the weather certainly amenable to it, but the infrastructure in many places just don't provide a safe and comfortable place. And so you can see in this chart in the upper right that over time the number of people cycling actually increased overall, and those using the green lane was cycling as well. There still remained a number of people who are biking on the sidewalk, which is not comfortable for anyone, whether you're a pedestrian, a business owner, or for someone on a bike. So this design didn't meet all of the comfort demands that people on bikes have, but did help quite a bit. There's a couple examples in here on...
Mark,
yeah.
This is Hal. Sorry to interrupt, but we do, hoping that you could wrap it up in a couple of minutes. We do have a few questions that we want to make sure we get to before the conclusion of the webinar.
I'm wrapping it up in about a minute. So
okay, great.
Perfect timing. So there's a couple of transit streets in here as well where transit malls were done or redone in the case of Portland and in the case of Minneapolis. So if you're in a community that's looking at creating a transit mall in a more dense urban area, there's a couple of examples in the book that highlight those. And then there's one other really big signature project, which is covering the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, where the city of Indianapolis wanted to connect a whole sequence of really interesting cultural amenities in town by an off-street cycle track and sidewalk, and to take advantage where they could of that and take advantage of alleyways and so forth to create a loop, to create kind of a sense of place by reallocating some of their street space. So there's more information that you can get in the book on what they did and how they did it and what's come since. So all of the cases in the book are also summarized in a reference table to make it really easy if you want to search for examples by right-of-way or speed limit or ADT or the type of infrastructure. This is really designed to make it as user-friendly as possible. And as I mentioned before, all of the citations and data that's included in each case study, there's links to more sources. So that's the overview of the book, why it came about, what we hope people will use it for. And you can actually download a free PDF copy if you like at rethinkingstreets.com. At that site are also links if you want a print copy how you can get a print copy for a nominal cost, really for just the cost of printing and a little bit of handling. So that's what I have to give. Again, I'd like to thank NITC for making this project possible, and actually for having the vision that helping to meet the needs of our transportation systems across the country is not just through sort of standard ways of thinking about research or education, but also thinking in terms of how we can create applied formats to get knowledge into practice to help make transportation life, at least in our communities, better. So with that, I think I will end, and I'll be open for questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marc. I'm sure we could spend a lot more time going through some more examples. I know that the examples that you presented really did raise some really good questions from the audience. So I'll just go through them in the order that they were submitted. The first one goes back to one of your original slides. Dwayne Waken is wondering, what % of total baby boomers are active boomers? Do you know?
That's a good question. I don't know. But
Okay.
that's if you look at all of the demographic pyramids, the age pyramids. I mean, that's the baby boomer is a bulge. So I don't know what the overall percentage is, but those types of numbers are easy to get from national statistics.
Okay, great. This next question is from Patrick Miller. He's wondering about the cost. So what about cost? Can poor communities afford this?
So there's all kinds of ways to think about costs, right? So some streets that are just reallocating space through striping, those are really low cost. And none of the examples, or most of the examples, we're not talking about expanding right-of-way, acquiring buildings, building new curbs, putting in center medians that are cement and so forth. So I think the range of examples in the book point to a range of infrastructure costs that you can take on, again, from paint, which are low cost, to more expensive infrastructure like that last one in the Indianapolis Cultural Trail. So there's a whole wide range. I mean, of course, money matters, but I'd say the bigger barrier for many projects like these is not cost, but kind of a community and political will to rethink how space is allocated.
Great. So this next question is from Pauline Burns, and I think she's referring to one of your specific examples that you had presented earlier. And her question is, how does green painted lanes hold up over time?
So I feel like I'm going to defer this one as well. Not my particular area of expertise. I know the painting of green spaces, whether they're the lanes or bike boxes that are happening in some cities, are relatively new in the U.S. And accelerating in their use around the country. And so I'm sure that the monitoring of their use and the different types of application and different types of material mix are under evaluation, and there's probably some manufacturer or research studies showing that. So I might actually defer back to Hal, if anyone in NITC is doing research on that.
Sure. I do know that in some communities it's not necessarily green paint that they're using, but thermoplastic, and it just depends on the type of environment that it's applied in. So in colder climates or in areas where there's higher traffic volumes that's actually going over the thermoplastic, then it degrades fairly quickly over time. But it depends on sort of environmental considerations.
And I will say that I haven't seen it yet in the U.S., but like in the Netherlands, where they have an extensive bike infrastructure, they actually mix red pigment into their asphalt when they lay it down for the bike lane. So all the bike infrastructure is red or reddish color, and it's rather than laying something on top of a street, they actually mix it into the materials themselves to have a permanence there.
Okay. So this next question is from Robert Liberty, and he's curious about the nature of the research on the impact on adjacent commercial uses, which he feels is one of the most contentious issues. So I'm not sure if you want to comment on that.
Sure, I'd like to comment on that. Good question. So it's always this contentious issue. You know, if you have a business on a street that seems to be doing okay, then of course from a business perspective to redesign a street can feel like a risk, right? Because it's a change in the street and how will that impact my business. And there are not a lot of studies that that are really well done that are before and after an economic activity. But some of the studies that have been done are actually on some of the streets that are in this book. And in general, the post situation actually tends to increase private investment, increase business activity, rather than decrease it. In some cases, there might be small decreases during the time of construction, which is something that local municipalities can address directly through marketing campaigns, to let the community know that the businesses are still open, and other types of policy interventions for the short term. But the basic story is that when you create places where people like to be, then business activity tends to generate. And in a lot of cases, when you actually create places where people like to be, it puts different types of pressure on the value of the land, that in fact different types of use of the land people get interested in different types of use of the land. So in fact, it's possible that in many cases the value of the land can go up, which can change to different types of uses that support place making and support walking and biking and transit use. So I guess that was a little bit of a rambling answer. The short answer is there's not a lot of great studies out there, but those that have been done more or less show that when you create streets that are multimodal, that are place-making, businesses tend to do better. And it makes sense. When you design streets that are primarily designed to move vehicles through space, that is not a design that says vehicles stop here. And then the sort of a parallel to that, when our vehicles, when you think that your business is dependent on the number of vehicles that go by, it's kind of a false way of thinking, that the businesses really do better when people come by, not vehicles. And if every vehicle has one person in it, then what's the difference between having a vehicle or having someone on foot? Well, there's actually a lot of difference, because when you create a place for streets as places, you actually get more people to be able to walk from store to store and so forth. So that's been the history of the examples. There's a great opportunity for more economic studies to be done. But it seems that the evidence is pointing in a positive direction in terms of economic activity.
Okay, so we have about like 10 more questions remaining, Mark, so I just want to be cognizant of our time and try to get through these quickly. The next one is from Roger Gutierrez. FHWA is no longer accepting experiments on the green-backed striped sharrows. How can this example be applied to guide the rethinking of other streets?
Well, so there's, all the ways that those rules and approvals get made. And there's a lot of experimentation going around the country, and I think the best thing to do is do the studies to show that things work, or if they work or not work, and keep putting pressure on the status quo system to be more experimental. There are so many examples around the U.S. and around the world, and we're just a little bit behind in this country on moving forward. We're kind of really stuck in this old framing, and it just takes a long time to change that boat. The work of NACDO has been fantastic in saying there are different designs that we should be pursuing for streets that are inside of our more developed parts of our cities, that we shouldn't always be designing our streets based on kind of highway and rural roadway design standards. So use the examples. Some communities are willing to be more experimental and ask for forgiveness rather than permission, documenting and making the case for how they're working is the best way to change policy and practice and the guidelines at the federal level.
Okay. So Patrick Miller's question is, where did the $130 million in private investment come from in the Lancaster project?
So I can't recall all the details of everything, so I was a little bit off the top of my head and might be a little bit more of a generic answer because it happened in a few of the projects. But it tends to come in from new development that happens, whether it's new mixed-use buildings, new office, commercial space, that type of thing that comes in. And when you have a very exclusively auto-oriented land use next to a very auto-oriented street, that's full of parking lots, and it's not a real efficient use of land. But as soon as you create spaces that are amenable to all modes and have a place function, and it increases the value of that land because there's accessibility to more destinations. So the external investment would have come from private developers taking advantage of this new type of space making that was created by the redesign of the street.
Okay. When you were writing this book, did you see any interesting example of incorporating complete street principles in streets that are very urban? And so the example given here is, for example, in downtown Toronto, they only have 2 lanes each way with no parking or no median.
That's a good question. We had a lot of examples from which to choose from, so I guess I'm not recalling anything quite like that. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, we ended up really quickly sorting out examples that felt really, might have been really great, but kind of outlier examples in terms of what most communities are kind of dealing with. And I think a subsequent book on sort of amazing outlier examples would also be really beneficial. Signature bike redesigns would be really interesting, but I can't recall things in highly urban areas that were a little bit more radical than like the, I mean, I think the sort of radical one here would be that Pine Street example, right, of taking a very narrow, dense area and taking one auto lane and making it into a buffered bike lane. But beyond that, creating shared space, streets, or things like that, I don't recall offhand.
Okay. So in your Long Beach example, shouldn't the bicycles be between the sidewalk and the parked cars rather than the parked cars between the sidewalk and bike lane?
Oh, that's a long discussion. Yes. So the short answer would be yes. It is very silly in this country that we have bikes protect parked cars from moving cars, that we should actually be using parked cars to protect people on bikes from the moving cars. So absolutely, that street and any street with a bike lane, the bike lane should be between parked cars and the sidewalk. That is a discussion that I'm happy to have and would support. A lot of places aren't there yet. And so this is kind of stage 1 examples. So yes, I also teach courses on bicycle transportation, and I generally would not advocate as an ultimate design some of those designs that I showed, but I think as an interim design, they're okay. They're okay. They kind of get us part of the way there, and that's okay. I'd rather have part of the way there and have this evolution of going. That's why I think a follow-up book that really shows sort of robust examples in all these modes would also be instructive as well.
Okay, so this is in regards to a couple of other examples, or the Myrtle Beach example. So the road diets in both the city and Myrtle Beach seem to have increased the widths of the travel lanes. Wouldn't that eventually increase the vehicular speeds?
Could. So there's sort of 2 opposing forces happening here. Yeah, so wider lanes make it sort of reduce the friction that you might feel as a motorist, which sort of opens up your ability to go through and react to something that might come up to you. So that's, on the one hand, absolutely wider lanes can do that. I think the counterbalance, like in the Myrtle Beach example, is when you do have more explicit medians, the planting of trees both in the medians and on the sidewalk, the kind of the design, the aesthetics of the place create a different environment which says there's something else going on here, that there are actually going to be people walking and crossing, or families, or that type of thing, with the marked crosswalks really being emphasized and so forth. So the counterbalance to the wider lanes is some of the other urban design features that they put in to say, there's other modes and other people going to be here. Well, that's a good thing to be able to study and to see whether the design has changed speeds for better or for worse.
Okay, great. Gosh, we still have questions coming in, but I'll try to move through about 4 or 5 more, and then we will have to work with Marc on getting answers to some of the questions that are left unanswered. I think we could have continued this webinar for maybe a half hour more or so. So the next question is, did you have any success gathering data on increases in business, and what kind of collection methodology did you use with the businesses?
So it's a good question. So to be clear, the data that's included in all of these cases in terms of the before and after data on economic activity, on mode split or mode share, on accidents and so forth, that type of data was actually collected by other people locally, either researchers or local government or consultants and so forth. And what we are doing in this project is actually using it and collecting it and communicating it in a way that's very accessible. Some of the sort of original parts that we're adding to the mix is around the before and after, the cross sections, lane widths and that sort of thing, and the context maps and all that, but and putting it all in an accessible format. So in terms of the data collection methodology, that's case by case, and you can go to all the footnotes or the endnotes that are linked in the book to get the details of how that data was collected by the agencies that did it.
Okay, great. So Robert Liberty has left, but he left this comment, which I think is really great. So have you considered using the book's examples as the template for an online database that cities can contribute their own projects to? Yes. So we actually started in the collection in that way, and we're thinking about how to put it into the next stage so that additional examples can be put in, especially those that have, this before and after kind of data associated with it, so that more communities can have access to it. I will say that since the book got put out in last January, we had, thanks to NITC's help, 1,000 print copies that we were able to distribute free across the country. So those left in like 10 days. And then since we put it online, we've had over 5,000 downloads from over 20 countries, interestingly enough, by all of the stakeholders that we were targeting, which has been really thrilling from our end. So from city councilors, from traffic engineers, from urban designers, from planners, from community activists, from faculty, from students who are really willing to do these things. So where we go on the next step is a really great question, whether it's an online database that we can continue to collect and organize examples, to make sort of subsequent books focused on, like I said, signature bikeways or signature street retrofits. And those are all things that we're considering. We'll be looking for support to do that. All right, and unfortunately, that we have run out of time, and so this concludes our webinar. And so we will work with Marc on answering the rest of the questions that have been left unanswered. And for more information, you can visit our website, which is www.nitc.us/professional-development. And just a reminder that we have an upcoming free webinar on January 29th that looks at exploring pedestrian responsive traffic signal timing strategies in urban areas. And again, thank you, Marc, for this wonderful webinar. Again, I think we could have gone on for about half an hour longer in order to address all of the questions. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.